A sailor in the Middle Ages stared into an endless, empty horizon with no land in sight. His survival depended on secrets we have nearly forgotten. This is the world of medieval navigation, a lost art of cosmic wayfinding and incredible guesswork. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how these explorers charted the globe using little more than sunlight and seabirds. We will uncover how a simple crystal could reveal the sun on a cloudy day, and why the ocean's swells were a language only the most experienced could read. What forgotten piece of human ingenuity do you think was most vital for crossing an unknown sea? The open ocean was a canvas for every terror the medieval mind could conjure. Maps from the era are filled with leviathans and serpents, creatures said to drag entire ships into the abyss. Beyond these myths lay genuine, tangible fears. A sudden storm could shatter masts and tear sails to ribbons, leaving a vessel adrift and helpless. Pirates lurked along profitable trade routes, ready to seize cargo and enslave crews. But perhaps the most insidious threat was simply getting lost. A single misjudgment, one faulty reading of the stars or waves, could send a ship spiraling into a void of blue nothingness. With no land in sight for weeks, supplies of fresh water and food would dwindle to nothing. Scurvy would weaken the men, their bodies failing as hope faded. Desperation bred mutiny, turning comrades against each other in a frantic struggle for a few more days of life. This is why navigation was so much more than a skill. It was the single thread separating a triumphant voyage from a ghost ship's tale. The secrets of reading the sky and sea were not merely academic. They were state secrets, fiercely protected by ship captains and the powerful merchant guilds that controlled trade. To know these arts was to hold the power of life and death in your hands, a power worth killing for, and certainly worth dying to protect. Into this world of desperation and fear sailed a revolutionary tool, a simple device that could point the way north even under a starless sky. It was the magnetic compass, but its early form was far from the precise instrument we know today. Picture a magnetized sliver of iron, carefully placed on a straw or a chip of wood and set afloat in a bowl of water. There it would spin slowly until it settled, one end stubbornly facing north. The mystery of how sailors first discovered this property of the earth remains. Was it by chance, a needle left near a strange rock that suddenly twitched to life? Some believed the compass was guided by the influence of distant stars, while others whispered it was pure magic, a trick of demons that could lead a pious man astray. Its behavior only fueled these superstitions. A compass needle could become erratic near a ship's own metal cargo, seemingly possessed. During violent electrical storms, it might dance wildly in its bowl, as if fighting invisible forces. And this tool, for all its wonder, had one profound limitation. It could tell you which way you were facing, but it could never tell you where you were. You could sail north for a week, confident in your direction, yet have no idea if you were a day from land or a month lost at sea. The compass was a single, vital whisper of guidance in a roaring symphony of unknowns, a revolutionary piece of a much larger puzzle that no sailor would dare to solve with just one tool. Yet this single whisper of direction was given a voice through another marvel, the portolan chart. Unroll one of these vast maps and you are not looking at a picture of the world, but a web of possibilities. Its most striking feature is a spiderweb of lines radiating from central points like compass roses. These are room lines, a direct path you could follow from one port to another. A sailor would simply align his compass with the line pointing to his destination and hold that course. This was the closest thing to medieval turn-by-turn navigation. But the true magic of these charts was not in the lines themselves, but in the knowledge they represented. Each curve of a coastline, each marked shoal and safe harbor was a hard-won secret. This information was gathered over generations, passed from pilot to pilot, a collective memory of the sea drawn on vellum. The charts themselves were beautiful objects drawn on treated animal skin that could withstand the damp, salty air of a ship's cabin. Their edges were often filled with illustrations of bustling cities and strange beasts, a mix of practical geography and lingering myth. Possessing an accurate portolan chart was like holding the keys to a kingdom of trade and power, which is why maritime states guarded them as fiercely as any treasure. But for all their coastal precision, these maps had a terrifying limitation. Once the coastline dropped below the horizon and a ship was truly in the open ocean, the portolan chart became a beautiful, useless piece of art. Its web of room lines could not help you when there was no land in sight to connect them to. So how did a navigator, armed with his compass and his cherished chart, cross the vast, empty blue between continents? To cross the featureless ocean, navigators relied on a desperate form of educated guesswork known as dead reckoning. The process began from a last known point, a sliver of coastline disappearing astern. From that moment, every movement was an estimate. Speed was measured with a device of beautiful simplicity, the chip log. A sailor would toss a weighted piece of wood, the chip, over the stern. A long rope, knotted at regular intervals, would pay out from a reel as the ship moved away from the floating wood. He would count the number of knots that slipped through his fingers in a time measured by a half-minute hourglass. The number of knots counted gave them their speed, a term we still use for nautical miles per hour. But this was not a digital readout. It was a man counting knots in a rolling sea, with the wind whipping the rope and the chip bobbing erratically in the ship's wake. This raw data, speed and direction from the compass, was then recorded on a traverse board. This was a circular piece of wood with holes drilled in a compass pattern and pegs attached by a string. Every half hour, the helmsman would peg a hole to mark the ship's heading. The number of knots measured during that time would be recorded too. It was a physical, ticking ledger of the ship's journey. You can think of it like trying to guess how far you have driven on a long, winding road at night, with no odometer and only a general sense of your average speed. Now imagine doing that for 30 days straight, with invisible forces constantly pushing you off course. A current you cannot see might be adding 5 miles to your progress each day, or secretly stealing that distance away. A steady wind could be setting you dozens of miles to the side without you ever realizing it. The half-minute hourglass was never perfectly accurate, and the man counting knots might miss one or the sand might stick. Each tiny error was a seed, and over weeks at sea, that seed would grow into a massive miscalculation. A ship aiming for a small island could easily find itself 100 miles off target, sailing past its destination into an empty horizon, its crew none the wiser until their water ran out. Dead reckoning was a continuous act of faith, a line drawn across a map of pure uncertainty, growing fainter and less reliable with every passing day. Against this growing tide of navigational guesswork, a new class of tool promised to pull a fixed position from the moving sky. The astrolabe was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, a heavy brass disc intricately engraved with a map of the heavens. To use it, a navigator would hold it by a ring at its top, letting it hang perfectly vertical. He would then sight the sun through 2 small pinholes on a moving arm called the alidade. When a beam of light passed through both holes, he could read the sun's angle above the horizon from the finely marked scale on the disc's edge. This measurement, taken at local noon when the sun was at its highest point, was the key to unlocking latitude. By comparing that noon altitude to complex astronomical tables, a sailor could calculate his distance north or south of the equator. But the astrolabe's beautiful complexity was its greatest weakness on the open ocean. Performing this delicate operation required steady hands and a stable platform, 2 things a sailor never had on the deck of a ship heaving in the swells. The heavy disc would swing wildly, the sun would vanish behind clouds or the rigging, and the entire frustrating process could take many minutes if it worked at all. For this reason, many navigators turned to a simpler, more robust instrument, the mariner's quadrant. It was essentially a quarter circle of wood or metal with a scale of 90 degrees marked along its curved edge. A weighted plumb line hung from the apex of the angle. The user would line up the two straight edges with the sun, and the point where the plumb line crossed the scale gave the solar altitude. It was less elaborate but far from easy. Holding the quadrant steady while squinting at the sun and watching a swinging line demanded immense concentration. A single misreading of a degree or two could translate to a miscalculation of dozens of miles in position. This was not work for an ordinary sailor. It demanded a man who could not only handle the instrument but also understand the geometry behind it and perform the necessary calculations. This mathematical knowledge placed celestial navigation firmly in the hands of an educated elite, often the ship's master or a dedicated pilot. The push to master these celestial tools was championed by figures like Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal. While he seldom sailed himself, he established a center of learning that gathered the finest minds in astronomy, cartography, and navigation. At his school on the Sagres Peninsula, Jewish astronomers, Arab mathematicians, and seasoned Portuguese sea captains exchanged knowledge. They refined the use of the astrolabe and quadrant, creating more accurate tables and training a new generation of navigators in their use. This systematic approach transformed exploration from a gamble into a calculated enterprise. Yet, even with this sophisticated technology, a fundamental problem remained. A navigator could now determine his latitude, his north-south position, with reasonable accuracy. But he had no way to find his longitude, his east-west position. He knew what parallel he was on, but not where he was along that infinite line. He could be sailing directly toward his island target, or he could have passed it hours ago in the night with no way to tell the difference. The celestial calculators had solved one half of the greatest puzzle of the sea, leaving the other half shrouded in complete mystery. The sun's daily arc held the secret to a ship's north-south position, a secret unlocked in one precise moment each day. This was the ritual of the noon sight, a navigator's most critical daily task. As midday approached, the ship's master or his pilot would begin his careful preparations. He would take out his quadrant or astrolabe, checking the instrument for any damage from the sea air. His eyes would turn upward, tracking the sun's slow, relentless climb. The goal was to catch it at its absolute peak, the moment it crossed the local meridian and reached its highest point above the horizon. This was local noon, the moment that defined their latitude. Timing was everything. A measurement taken just 5 minutes too early or too late would show a sun that was not at its true peak, resulting in an angle that was slightly off. That tiny error, a single degree in the sun's altitude, could mean the ship was misplaced on the chart by over 60 nautical miles. In an ocean where an island might be only a few miles across, such a mistake could be catastrophic. How could they possibly know the exact second of local noon without a modern clock? They used the instrument itself. The navigator would take a series of quick measurements as the sun rose, watching the angle increase with each reading. The moment the angle stopped increasing and began to decrease, that was the peak. That was the moment he needed. He would note the highest angle achieved, the sun's noon altitude, and the real work would begin. This raw number was useless on its own. He then had to consult his precious astronomical tables, often carried in a worn, leather-bound book. These tables, compiled by scholars on land, told him what the sun's altitude should be at that exact date for various latitudes. By matching his measured angle to the values in the tables, he could read off his latitude directly. It was a system of incredible ingenuity, linking a brass instrument on a tossing deck to the predictable motions of the cosmos. But the entire system depended on one thing: a clear view of the sun. On a day when thick clouds blanketed the sky, the ritual was impossible. The sun would be a faint, diffuse glow, its position impossible to pinpoint. On those days, the navigator had no choice. He would simply mark his chart with the words, "No observation," and fall back on the uncertain art of dead reckoning, his line of estimated position growing fainter and less trustworthy with every passing hour. Even when it worked perfectly, this celestial method had a profound limitation. It told a sailor his latitude, his position between the equator and the pole, but it was completely silent on his longitude. He knew precisely what east-west line he was on, but he had no idea where he was along that endless line. He could be a day's sail from his destination, or he might have already passed it in the night, sailing onward into an empty ocean with a terrifying and perfect confidence. While the sun offered a fleeting daily measurement, another celestial body provided a constant, unwavering guide through the long night. Polaris, the North Star, hung like a fixed pivot point in the northern heavens, a beacon of cosmic stability for every sailor brave enough to venture beyond sight of land. Its singular reliability came from its unique position, sitting almost directly above the Earth's North Pole. For an observer on the ground, this meant Polaris never set. It simply traced a tiny, tight circle in the sky, while all the other stars wheeled in great arcs around it. This made it the perfect reference point. A navigator could always find north by locating this one steady star, but its true genius lay in something even more profound. The angle of Polaris above the horizon, its altitude, was a direct readout of your latitude. At the equator, Polaris would sit right on the horizon at 0 degrees. As you sailed north, the star would climb higher in the sky. By the time you reached a latitude of 45 degrees north, Polaris would be halfway between the horizon and directly overhead. If you reached the North Pole itself, the star would be directly above you at 90 degrees. Your latitude was literally written in the sky, a number you could measure each clear night. Without complex instruments, sailors developed remarkably clever methods to read this number. One of the simplest was the finger width system. A sailor would stretch his arm out completely and hold his hand sideways against the sky. The width of one finger from his viewpoint covered roughly 2 degrees of the sky. He would count how many finger widths separated Polaris from the horizon. 4 fingers meant about 8 degrees of latitude. This was not precise science, but it was a vital, constant check on their dead reckoning, a way to confirm they were on the right parallel. This steadfast nature made Polaris more than a tool. It became a character in maritime legends, a divine nail holding up the canopy of the night, a spiritual guide that would never lead a righteous traveler astray. Its constancy offered psychological comfort as powerful as its navigational aid. But this entire system of celestial certainty had a devastating geographical limit. For a ship sailing south of the equator, the North Star dipped below the horizon and vanished. The southern sky had no single bright star marking the celestial pole. Instead, navigators faced a rotating carousel of stars with no fixed center. They had to learn complex patterns like the Southern Cross and use its pointers to estimate the location of the invisible South Pole. It was a far more difficult and less certain art. This fundamental asymmetry in the heavens gave Northern Hemisphere explorers a massive advantage for centuries, while the vast expanse of the southern oceans remained a far more terrifying and impenetrable mystery, a void without a guiding light. While southern explorers struggled without a pole star, northern sailors had perfected a form of solar navigation centuries earlier. The Vikings crossed thousands of miles of treacherous, fog-shrouded ocean, reaching North America long before magnetic compasses were common in Europe. They accomplished this with tools that seem to border on myth. The most legendary is the Sunstone, a mysterious crystal mentioned in their sagas. Modern analysis suggests this was likely a piece of Iceland spar, a transparent calcite crystal that possesses a remarkable property. It can polarize light. On a completely overcast day when the sun is just a bright patch in the gray, the crystal could be rotated before the navigator's eye. At a certain orientation, the crystal would appear a darker, clearer yellow, while in another it would brighten. This change revealed the polarization pattern of the sunlight filtering through the clouds, effectively pointing to the hidden sun's position with startling accuracy. It was like having a window to the sky on the cloudiest of days, but knowing the sun's location was only half the battle. To turn that information into a reliable direction, they needed a fixed reference, a primitive clock. This is where the Unartok disk comes into play. Discovered at a Norse farmstead in Greenland, this wooden artifact is riddled with notches and a central gnomon, the part that casts a shadow. It was far more than a simple sundial. Researchers believe it was a sophisticated solar compass. A navigator would orient the disk so the shadow of the gnomon fell along the correct carved line for that time of day. Once aligned, the other lines on the disk would point to the cardinal directions. This system compensated for the sun's changing position throughout the day and across the seasons, allowing a Viking captain to find true north with a precision that dead reckoning could never offer. Combining the sunstone's ability to locate the sun through cloud with the Unartok disk's power to translate that position into a fixed direction created a formidable navigational system. A navigator could take a bearing even in poor weather, reset his course, and hold it with confidence. This explains how Viking longships could strike out across the vast North Atlantic, from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and finally from Greenland to the coast of Newfoundland. They were not simply wandering, they were following a solar roadmap, using the subtle physics of light and shadow to conquer an ocean that should have been impassable. Their success was built not on complex brass instruments, but on a profound understanding of the natural world, reading secrets in the light that were invisible to everyone else. Tracing a course across one of these intricate portolan charts meant learning to read a language of lines and wind. The most prominent features were the wind roses, ornate compass stars scattered across the map's surface. Each rose was a circle divided into 8, 16, or even 32 points, each point named for the wind that blew from that direction. The tramontana was the north wind, a cold breath from the mountains. The sirocco blew from the southeast, carrying dust from the deserts of Africa. These were not mere decorations. They were a functional diagram of the Mediterranean soul, a catalogue of the very forces that could speed a ship home or dash it against the rocks. Radiating from these wind roses was the true genius of the system, a spiderweb of room lines. A room line, also called a loxodrome, is a path that cuts across every meridian, every north-south line at the exact same angle. Think of it as a straight line on a flat map, a course you can set and hold without constant adjustment. This was the medieval equivalent of a highway. A navigator would find his port of departure and his destination on the chart, and then identify the specific room line that connected them. Let us say the line ran from the wind rose at a bearing of northeast by east. He would then align the north arrow of his magnetic compass with that same bearing and simply steer to keep the needle in that position. For days or even weeks, his entire purpose was to keep that needle steady, faithfully following an invisible thread stretched across the open ocean. It was a system of profound simplicity that made transoceanic travel a conceivable, repeatable act. But this elegant simplicity came with a hidden, costly flaw. Our world is not flat, it is a sphere, and on the curved surface of a globe, a room line is not the shortest distance between 2 points. That honor belongs to a great circle route, an arc that represents the true minimum distance. A great circle route might, for example, arc far to the north before sweeping back down to a destination, looking like a curved line on a flat map. Following a room line, by contrast, was like taking the long way around the edge of a field instead of cutting diagonally across its center. It was a longer voyage, adding days or even weeks to a journey, consuming more supplies and exposing the crew to more danger. So why did they choose the longer path? Because the Great Circle route demanded constant, complex course corrections. To sail the perfect arc, a navigator would have to change his compass bearing every hour, a nearly impossible task with the tools at hand. The room line, for all its extra miles, offered something priceless, a single, steady bearing that a tired man could hold through storm and calm alike. It traded efficiency for a brutal, reliable simplicity, a straight line drawn on a round world. But the room line's promise of a straight path could only guide a ship so far before the land itself reached out with invisible, treacherous fingers. In the final approach to a fog-bound coast, a navigator had to trade the grand scale of the heavens for the intimate language of the seabed. His most vital tool for this was the humble lead line. Picture a solid lead weight, perhaps 7 pounds heavy, attached to a long, meticulously marked rope. A cavity was carved into the base of the weight and filled with tallow, a sticky animal fat. A sailor would stand at the ship's bow, swing the lead in a wide arc, and cast it forward into the water, letting the line run through his fingers as the ship advanced. The moment the weight struck the bottom, the tension in the line would change, and he would feel a distinct slackening. He would then read the depth from the marks on the line, knots or bits of leather and cloth tied at specific intervals. But the true magic was in the tallow. When he hauled the lead back up, the grease in its cavity would be packed with a sample of the ocean floor. It might be coarse yellow sand, fine gray mud, sticky blue clay, or tiny pieces of broken shell. To an experienced pilot, this sample was as distinctive as a street sign. He would consult his coastal pilot book, a written companion to the portolan chart, which recorded the characteristics of the seabed along every known stretch of coastline. One chart might note that the approach to a certain river estuary was marked by a band of black mud in 20 fathoms of water, followed by a shoal of white sand in 10. By matching the sample on his lead to these records and confirming it with his depth reading, the navigator could pinpoint his position with astonishing accuracy, even when the shore was completely hidden by fog or darkness. This was not celestial guesswork, it was tactile navigation, feeling your way home by the very dirt beneath the waves. A sudden change from deep, soft mud to hard, shallow gravel was an urgent warning of an approaching sandbar, a hidden wall that could tear the hull from a ship in an instant. In the final, tense miles of a long voyage, the lead line was a constant companion, its rhythmic casting and retrieving a drumbeat of caution and discovery, pulling the hidden landscape of the deep up into the sailor's hands and finally making the invisible coast a known and safe reality. Beyond the lead line's reach, the ocean itself spoke a language of life and movement. Seasoned sailors learned to read the subtle cues of the natural world, interpreting birds, whales, and even the color of the water as living signposts. The appearance of certain bird species was a moment of high drama. A lone seagull, for instance, was a powerful symbol of hope. These coastal birds rarely ventured more than 50 or 60 miles from land, so their presence meant that a coastline was likely just a day's sail away. Different species served as different indicators. The sight of a gannet, a bird of the open ocean, might mean you were in deep waters, while a flock of terns could point toward a specific island chain. Sailors memorized the distinct flight patterns of these birds, knowing that watching their direction at dawn and dusk could reveal the location of unseen shores, as the birds would fly out to sea to feed in the morning and return to land to roost in the evening. The movements of whales offered another layer of intelligence. These great creatures often followed specific migratory routes that corresponded with underwater topography, like seamounts and deep sea trenches where their food was abundant. Spotting a pod of whales on a consistent bearing was not just a spectacle, it was a clue. It suggested you were crossing a known marine highway, a path that could be cross-referenced with a pilot's mental map of the ocean's hidden landscape. Even the type of seaweed floating past the hull told a story. Sargassum, with its berry-like bladders, indicated you were in the warm, central currents of an ocean gyre, while other weeds hinted at the proximity of rocky shores or estuaries. High above, the clouds painted a picture of distant land. A stationary, puffy cumulus cloud clinging to an otherwise clear horizon could mark the location of an island miles away, its formation triggered by the warm air rising from the landmass below. This entire body of knowledge was organic, accumulated over a lifetime at sea and passed down not in books but through stories and poems from old salt to young apprentice. It was a science blended with folklore, where a sailor might swear that a certain bird cried only when a storm was approaching. This deep, experiential reading of the environment finds its most profound parallel in the epic voyages of the Polynesian navigators. They crossed thousands of miles of the Pacific by memorizing the star paths, reading the refraction of swells against distant islands, and observing the flight of birds with a precision that rivaled any European instrument. While medieval European navigators developed their own rich oral traditions, the Polynesian methods show a separate path to the same truth, that the entire natural world is a map for those who have learned how to see it. These organic skills formed a final, vital layer of guidance, a way to sense the presence of land long before it was visible, turning the overwhelming emptiness of the sea into a world filled with meaning and direction. A navigator's most trusted map was not made of parchment but of water and air. He learned to read the ocean's swells as another man might read the lines on a page. These great rolling waves, generated by distant weather systems, moved with a consistency that the choppy, wind-driven surface waves lacked. An experienced sailor could feel the underlying swell through the very timbers of his ship, a deep, rhythmic pulse that spoke of the open ocean's true character. The direction from which these swells came was a constant reference, a kind of liquid compass. When a new, conflicting swell pattern began to intersect the dominant one, it was a sign of immense importance. This new rhythm was often a refracted swell, a wave that had bent around an unseen landmass miles beyond the horizon. The ocean was telling him that an island or a coastline was interrupting its flow, sending a silent, tangible signal of its presence through the water long before it could be seen. This was not a calculation. It was a sensation, a skill earned by spending years feeling the ship's motion, learning to distinguish the dozen different pitches and rolls that spoke of deep water from the one that whispered of a hidden shore. The sky above offered its own clues. That lone, stationary cumulus cloud on an otherwise clear horizon was more than just weather. It was a marker. Islands absorb heat from the sun more effectively than the surrounding sea, causing warm air to rise above them. This rising air cools and condenses, forming a cloud that seems to be anchored to the land below, even when that land is still 30 or 40 miles away. A navigator seeing this would watch it for hours. If the cloud held its shape and position while others drifted with the wind, he knew with near certainty that he had found his bearing. This entire body of knowledge was deeply personal and intuitive. One sailor might describe the feeling of a particular swell as a long, lazy heave, while another might sense it as a firm, pushing shoulder. They developed a vocabulary for the sea's moods that was passed down through generations, a collection of poems and sayings that encoded survival. This art of reading the environment represented the final, unteachable layer of navigation. A man could be given a compass and taught to use an astrolabe, but this sensitivity to the living sea could only be earned through countless sunrises and storms, a profound conversation between a sailor and the world he sought to cross. This strategy of reading the sea and sky was about to be tested on an unprecedented scale, pushing ships into the heart of the Atlantic. The Portuguese developed a brilliant, counterintuitive maneuver called the volta do mar, the turning of the sea. The problem was simple but immense. A ship sailing south along the African coast faced a powerful, steady northerly current and persistent headwinds that made the return journey north a brutal, grinding fight against the elements. It could take weeks to make minimal progress, with ships being pushed backward as often as they moved forward. The solution, however, required a breathtaking leap of faith. Navigators discovered that by abandoning the coast entirely and sailing far out into the open Atlantic, they could find a different set of winds, the dependable westerlies of the mid-latitudes. A ship returning from Africa would not point its bow directly toward Portugal. Instead, it would swing west away from all known land, venturing hundreds of miles into the blue unknown. It was a deliberate act of getting lost to ultimately find a more efficient way home. For days, the crew would see nothing but empty ocean, their only companion the steadily blowing wind that now filled their sails from behind. They would ride these westerlies in a great, sweeping arc north and then east, a gigantic clockwise loop across the Atlantic that would eventually curve them back toward the Azores and the coast of Europe. This was the Volte du Mar in action. Think of it like walking against a dense, oncoming crowd. The direct route is exhausting and slow, but if you step out of the crowd, walk down a parallel empty street, and then cut back in further ahead, you save immense energy and time. The Volte du Mar was that empty street on an oceanic scale. It transformed the Atlantic from a terrifying barrier into a vast, circular highway. But this strategy demanded more than just knowledge. It required a profound psychological shift. A captain had to possess the courage to watch the last sliver of Africa vanish astern, and then intentionally steer his vessel into a void, trusting completely in a wind pattern he could not see, heading for a landfall he could not prove existed until he saw it. This was the moment coastal hugging truly died, replaced by a new confidence in blue water navigation. The Volte du Mar was not just a sailing route, it was the birth certificate of the Age of Discovery, a single, elegant solution that unlocked the entire planet. This elegant system of room lines and compass bearings held a hidden flaw, one that could silently steer a ship toward disaster. For all its reliability, the magnetic compass did not point to the true North Pole of the planet. It pointed to the magnetic North Pole, a wandering point on the Earth's surface that is constantly on the move. The angle between these two norths, true geographic north and magnetic north, is called magnetic declination, and it varies from place to place. A medieval navigator setting sail from Lisbon might find his compass needle pointed slightly to the east of true north. But if he sailed his room line all the way to the Azores, he might discover, to his profound confusion, that the very same compass bearing now pointed slightly west of true north. His trusted needle was not fixed. It was a liar whose deception changed with the longitude. The first evidence of this came not from a single catastrophic failure, but from a slow, creeping inconsistency. Captains comparing notes would find that two ships following identical compass courses from different starting points could arrive at the same destination on slightly different paths. Or a ship returning to a known port might find itself consistently off by a few miles, its perfect compass track somehow leading it astray. The most careful navigators, those who cross-referenced their compass readings with celestial observations of Polaris, were the first to grow suspicious. They saw that the star and the needle did not always agree. This was more than a simple error. It was a fundamental crack in their understanding of the world. How could the universe provide two different norths? Some theorized the existence of a great magnetic mountain somewhere in the Arctic, pulling the needle from its true course. Others saw it as a divine test of faith, a trick placed on the Earth to challenge the arrogant. The most pragmatic response was to simply map the error. As voyages became more frequent, pilots began to record these discrepancies in their rudders, the notebooks that were their most personal tools. They would note that off the coast of Brittany, the compass varied 2 degrees to the east, while in the Baltic Sea, it might vary 4 degrees to the west. They were empirically charting a phenomenon they could not explain, creating the first crude maps of the Earth's invisible magnetic personality. This was a triumph of practical observation over theoretical understanding. These sailors did not know they were documenting the effects of our planet's molten iron core churning far beneath their feet. They only knew that their most reliable guide was subtly, mysteriously untrustworthy, and that survival depended on learning its specific lies. Their meticulous notes became a secret language of correction, a way to listen to the compass's whisper while knowing when to doubt its voice. Yet the compass and the chart were only as good as the man interpreting them, and his most personal tool was never a brass instrument. It was a book tucked away in the captain's sea chest, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the damp, was his rudder. This was not a published map, but a handwritten log, its pages filled with the ink-stained wisdom of personal experience. The word itself comes from the French word for a road, a routier, and that is precisely what it was, a set of sailing directions for the sea roads. A captain's entire career could be distilled into one of these volumes. He would record everything, the precise bearing to sail from the mouth of one river to the entrance of the next, the exact depth of water over a treacherous sandbar at low tide, the appearance of a distinctive cliff face when viewed from 3 miles offshore, noting a peculiar white streak of bird droppings that made it identifiable in the fog. This was hyper-local life or death knowledge. One entry might read, when you raise the high peak of the island, steer due west by the compass until you sound 70 fathoms on a bottom of dark gravel, then turn north-northwest, for a hidden reef lies half a league to the east. These rudders were so vital that they were secretly copied and traded among a trusted network of pilots. To possess a good rudder was to hold a collection of shortcuts and survival secrets. But these books were far more than dry technical manuals. They were also repositories of fear and hope. Alongside the tidal calculations, a captain might jot down a prayer to Saint Nicholas, the patron saint of sailors, asking for protection in a coming storm. He might include a warning passed down from an old salt, describing a cove where serpents were said to coil around the masts of unwary ships. These entries blended hard-won fact with enduring myth, because on a dark night in an unknown sea, every possible danger, real or imagined, had to be accounted for. The rudder was therefore a deeply human document, a mixture of meticulous observation and superstitious dread. It was a captain's brain trust, a collection of everything he knew to be true and everything he feared might be. In a world without lighthouses or buoy markers, this handwritten, often illegible book was the final, most reliable guide, its value far exceeding that of any gold in the ship's hold. The pilot stood apart from the rest of the crew, a man who carried the weight of every soul aboard in his memory of the sea. His education was not found in any school, but in a brutal, lifelong apprenticeship that often began when he was just a boy. He would spend years as a servant to a master pilot, first learning to clean instruments and tie knots, then gradually being trusted to take soundings with the lead line and record the ship's heading on the traverse board. He learned to recognize the taste of the air before a squall and the specific shade of green in the water that signaled a shallow bank. This was a trade passed down through lived experience, a slow accumulation of secrets that could not be rushed. His value was immense, placing him among the highest-paid members of the entire expedition, often earning double the wage of the ship's captain. This was not payment for manual labor, but for the priceless contents of his mind. A key part of his power was literacy. While most of the crew relied on oral tradition and memory, the pilot could read the precious portolan charts, interpret the complex astronomical tables, and most importantly, write in his personal rudder. He was a walking library, the sole custodian of the collected knowledge required to bridge continents. With this authority came unbearable pressure. A single misjudgment, an error in his calculations, or a misreading of a cloud formation could mean the loss of a fortune in spices, the wreck of a king's galleon, and the deaths of every man who trusted him. His reputation was his most fragile possession. A pilot who ran a ship aground might never find work again, his name synonymous with failure and catastrophe. This is why the great explorers were nothing without their pilots. Christopher Columbus relied on the Pinzon brothers, seasoned mariners who helped guide the Santa Maria. Vasco da Gama's historic voyage to India was made possible by a legendary Arab pilot, Ahmad ibn Majid. who knew the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean like the back of his hand. These men were the true architects of empire, their uncanny skills turning the invisible pathways of the ocean into highways of global trade and conquest, all while holding the thin line between immortality and a watery grave. The night sky was a vast turning clock face, and Polaris was merely its central pin. Across the Mediterranean and the southern seas, navigators had to learn to read the time by all the other hands on the dial. They turned to the brightest stars in the heavens, like Sirius, the dog star, burning with a fierce blue-white intensity. By measuring the altitude of such a star at its highest point in the night, a navigator could, in principle, calculate his latitude just as he did with the sun. The process was the same. He would use his quadrant or astrolabe to find the star's peak angle above the horizon, and then consult his precious astronomical almanac. These almanacs were the navigator's calendar for the cosmos, predicting the precise position of dozens of key stars for every night of the year. They told him, for example, that on a certain date, the star Arcturus would reach its highest point at 45 degrees above the horizon if he was at a specific latitude. If he measured it at 50 degrees, he knew he was further north. This was an astronomy of breathtaking sophistication, translating the abstract motions of the universe into a practical tool for survival. But the challenges were immense. Identifying a specific star from a tossing deck, with the mast swinging across the sky and the horizon heaving, was a test of both skill and nerve. Was that bright point directly overhead really Vega, or was it a slightly dimmer star nearby? A misidentification could send him hundreds of miles off course. And unlike Polaris, these other stars were constantly moving, rising and setting throughout the night. The navigator had only a brief window to catch each one at its meridian, its highest point, for a clean measurement. For those daring to sail south of the equator, the problem was even more acute. Here, they relied on constellations like the Southern Cross, using the length of the cross or the positions of the two bright pointer stars beside it to estimate the location of the south celestial pole, a point in the sky marked by no bright star. This required memorizing complex geometric relationships in the dark. All of this celestial work was hostage to the weather. A single bank of clouds at the wrong moment could obliterate a star at the critical instant, rendering a whole night's observation useless and forcing another day of reliance on dead reckoning. Yet the very existence of these star calendars and methods reveals a profound truth. Medieval and Renaissance navigators were not just sailors. They were applied astronomers, using a deep, working knowledge of the cosmos to stitch together a map of the world, one star sighting at a time, long before the secrets of longitude would finally be unlocked. The moon's silent tug on the oceans became a force every captain had to master. While the stars gave position, the lunar cycle governed movement, dictating when a ship could approach a hostile shore or enter a narrow river mouth. Predicting the tide was not a matter of guesswork but of careful observation, passed down through generations of sailors who learned to read the moon's phases like a calendar. A full moon or a new moon meant spring tides, the most dramatic highs and lows, when powerful currents could either sweep a vessel into a safe harbor or expose jagged rocks that lay hidden at other times. A half moon signaled the weaker neap tides, a brief window of calmer water. This celestial rhythm was so reliable that medieval port authorities began compiling the knowledge into early tide tables. These were simple lists, often handwritten in the margins of a rudder, noting the exact hour of high water for a specific port on each day of the lunar month. To possess such a table for London or Antwerp was to hold a key to the city's wealth. A ship laden with wool or wine could time its arrival perfectly, catching the flood tide to carry it deep upriver, its hull clearing the bottom by inches. Misjudge that timing by even an hour, and the same ship would be left leaning on the mud, a helpless target for thieves or a sudden storm until the sea saw fit to return. This intimate knowledge of the tides revealed a deeper secret, a subtle clue to a ship's east-west position. A navigator crossing the open sea could note the exact time of local high tide by watching the turn of the current or the drift of seaweed. He would then compare this time to the high tide time listed for his home port in his tide table. If the local tide occurred, for example, 1 hour later, it suggested he was roughly 15 degrees of longitude to the west. This was not a precise measurement, but it was a vital piece of the puzzle, a way to sense longitudinal shift using nothing more than the moon's immutable schedule. For sailors who still saw the moon as a goddess or a celestial lantern, this practical use of its power was a perfect fusion of myth and measurement, where ancient stories of lunar magic met the patient, empirical work of marking tides on a parchment chart for years until the pattern became as clear as the moon itself. A single map could shatter an empire's monopoly on the world. In the year 1502, an Italian agent named Alberto Cantino accomplished one of the most stunning acts of cartographic espionage in history. He smuggled a map out of Portugal, a document so secret that its disclosure was considered treason. This was the Cantino Planisphere, a breathtakingly detailed chart that laid bare Portugal's most closely guarded discoveries. Its parchment surface revealed the true shape of Africa, proving a sea route to the Indian Ocean existed. Even more explosively, it showed a sliver of land in the western Atlantic, labeled as the land of the true cross, what we now call Brazil. This was not just a map, it was a stolen key to global power. For decades, Portugal had enforced a policy of absolute secrecy, known as the policy of silence. Ship captains were sworn to secrecy, and all maps were created under strict state control within the Casa da India in Lisbon. Disclosing a navigational chart to a foreign power was a capital offense, punishable by death. The logic was simple and brutal. Knowledge of winds, currents, and coastlines was a military and economic advantage as critical as any fleet of warships. Yet the Cantino map proved that secrets like trade winds could not be contained forever. Spies like Cantino, working for the Duke of Ferrara in Italy, were willing to pay immense sums and risk their lives to acquire this knowledge. Once such a map was smuggled out, it was quickly copied and circulated among the rival courts of Spain, France, and England. Each new line on a chart was a direct challenge, a dare for another nation to launch its own expeditions and claim its share of the spice trade and newfound land. This leak of the Cantino Planisphere did not just spread geographical facts. It ignited a firestorm of international competition, turning the 16th century into a high-stakes race for the globe, where a single sheet of vellum could be more valuable than a shipload of gold. The night sea was a different kind of wilderness, stripped of color and horizon, where the only landmarks were points of cold, distant fire. Without the sun, a navigator's world shrank to the deck beneath his feet and the star-charted map unfolding overhead. His primary method was to follow a star path, a technique as simple in concept as it was demanding in practice. He would pick a bright, known star that was rising in the east and set his course by it, holding that single celestial beacon steady against the mast or a rigging line. He would sail on that bearing until the star climbed too high to be a reliable guide or finally dipped below the western horizon. Then, without pause, he would pivot to a new rising star and begin the process again, stitching together a route from one fleeting guide to the next. It was a relentless, all-night dance with the spinning cosmos. To do this effectively, he needed an intimate knowledge of the night sky's specific clockwork. Certain constellations became his nightly companions. In the northern hemisphere, the Great Bear, what we call the Big Dipper, was more than a shape. Its two pointer stars reliably led the eye to Polaris, the one fixed point in the turning sky. But other formations served as rotating signposts. The Great Square of Pegasus might indicate a southerly course as it rose, while the brilliant V of Taurus could mark a specific season and direction. On a clear, moonless night, even the Milky Way became a tool. This hazy river of light, arcing directly overhead, served as a colossal, broad highway in the sky, providing a general east-west bearing across its luminous flow. But the sky was a fickle partner. A bank of clouds rolling in could extinguish this stellar map in minutes, plunging the navigator into a profound sensory deprivation. The wind's sound would change, the swells would become invisible, felt only as a disorienting lift and fall in the blackness. In these moments, every other sense strained for information. The smell of the air might hint at a distant rain squall, and the feel of the wind on his face became his only compass. With the stars gone, he had no choice but to fall back entirely on dead reckoning. He would trust the last known heading, maintain the best speed estimate from the chip log, and hope the currents had not betrayed him. It was a leap of faith, a gamble that his mental calculation of the ship's movement through the utter void was accurate. This is why coastal sailing at night was a terror to be avoided whenever possible. Unseen rocks, shifting sandbars, and the sudden loom of a cliff face were constant threats in the dark. Most captains, if they had the choice, would heave to and drift until dawn rather than risk the labyrinth of a shoreline they could not see. Yet in the open ocean, stopping was not an option. Schedules set by merchants and monarchs demanded continuous progress. Maintaining speed meant sailing through the night, a practice that separated the competent sea captain from the truly masterful pilot. It required a deep, unshakable trust in the stars, trust in his accumulated knowledge of their paths, and trust in his own ability to hold a course guided by nothing but pinpricks of light in an infinite black dome. The night asked everything of a navigator, rewarding his skill with quiet progress and punishing any doubt with a silence that could last forever. A navigator could calculate his latitude with confidence, but longitude remained a ghost in the machine, an invisible coordinate that defied every tool at his disposal. The problem was fundamentally one of time. To know how far east or west you have traveled, you must compare your local time, easily found from the sun's highest point, with the time at a fixed reference point like your home port. Every 4 minutes of time difference translates to 1 degree of longitude. If your local noon occurred when it was only 11 in the morning back in Lisbon, you knew you were 1 hour or 15 degrees to the west. The concept was simple, but the execution was utterly impossible. It required a clock that could keep perfect time for months on a rolling, salt-drenched ship, a feat no timepiece of the era could manage. The pendulum clocks that worked so well on land were useless at sea, their rhythm destroyed by the vessel's constant motion and by drastic changes in temperature and humidity. Without a reliable marine clock, a ship's east-west position was pure speculation. Desperate for a solution, minds turned to the heavens, proposing a method of lunar distances. This involved measuring the precise angle between the moon and a bright star, and then consulting incredibly complex tables to calculate the time at a prime meridian. It was a mathematical labyrinth that could take hours for a skilled astronomer on solid ground, let alone a weary navigator on a heaving deck. Others pinned their hopes on magnetic variation, the very flaw in the compass, believing its changing angle might correlate directly with longitude. They mapped the variations meticulously, only to discover the pattern was irregular and shifted over time, another dead end. The cost of this ignorance was measured in sunken ships and lost lives. In 1707, a British naval fleet under Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel, returning from a campaign, made a catastrophic longitude error. Thinking they were safely in the English Channel, they were in fact sailing directly toward the treacherous rocks of the Scilly Isles. 4 warships and over 2,000 sailors were lost in the ensuing wreck, a national tragedy that horrified the public and forced the government to act. This single disaster, born from a navigator's inability to pinpoint his east-west position, would ultimately set the stage for one of the greatest technological races in history, a contest to solve the longitude problem with a prize so vast it would inspire inventors for generations. The same sea that terrified sailors also captivated poets and painters, its mysteries spilling from nautical charts into the pages of illuminated manuscripts. Geoffrey Chaucer, a man who himself worked as a clerk of the king's works, populated his Canterbury Tales with characters whose lives were touched by this new age of travel. His shipman is a practical, weathered master of his vessel, a man who knows all the tides and harbors from Gotland to Cape Finisterre, a literary echo of the real pilots guiding ships through perilous waters. But the symbolism of navigation reached its most profound expression in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. In the opening lines, Dante finds himself lost in a dark wood, his spiritual state mirrored by terrestrial disorientation. His guide, Virgil, famously tells him they must seek another path, and the entire epic becomes a celestial voyage. Dante's journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise is charted with the precision of a stellar navigation manual, with the stars themselves serving as his final, blessed guide into the Empyrean. His ship of the soul, navigating the ocean of sin and redemption, transformed the technical act of wayfinding into a powerful metaphor for every human spiritual quest. This was not mere decoration. It was evidence that the tools of the sailor had captured the medieval imagination, providing a new language for the oldest of human questions, the journey toward salvation. Artists, too, were drawn to these emblems of exploration. In the margins of prayer books, delicate compass roses bloomed beside sacred text, their room lines pointing toward both earthly ports and heavenly grace. Astrolabes and quadrants appeared in the hands of saints and kings in stained glass windows, symbols of divine order and human intellect working in concert. Even the architecture of great cathedrals sometimes echoed the ship, with naves designed like an inverted hull, sheltering a congregation of spiritual voyagers. These cultural artifacts reveal a society grappling with a rapidly expanding world. The old TO maps, which depicted a flat circle of lands divided by a T-shaped ocean, were being fundamentally challenged by the portolan charts. These new maps did not place Jerusalem at the center of the world, but instead detailed a sprawling, interconnected coastline that stretched to Africa and hinted at lands beyond. This was a quiet revolution in perception. The world was no longer a static divine diagram, but a vast, dynamic space to be measured, explored, and ultimately conquered. The very act of navigation, once a practical skill for coastal traders, was now shaping philosophy and faith, reflecting a deep, collective shift from a world defined by myth to one increasingly measured by the stars. The true test of these ancient methods came not from old manuscripts, but from the decks of modern ships sailing into the past. Experimental archaeologists have built replicas of Viking longships and 15th century caravels, casting aside their GPS units to navigate solely with the tools of the medieval world. In one remarkable voyage, a crew used a crystal of Iceland spar as a sunstone, and even under a completely overcast sky, they were able to pinpoint the sun's location with an accuracy that stunned the researchers. They followed the same solar compass principles believed to be used with the Unartok disk, successfully crossing the North Atlantic along the Old Norse routes. These are not just historical reenactments, they are rigorous trials that prove the incredible efficiency of lost arts. We discover that a seasoned navigator using a lead line, a compass, and a deep reading of the waves could guide a ship with a precision we would never have credited without seeing it work. This hands-on rediscovery does more than confirm history. It fundamentally changes our appreciation for those explorers. We begin to understand that they were not simply lucky or recklessly brave. They were brilliant applied scientists of their environment, whose intuition was built upon a foundation of meticulous, generational observation. Their world was not one of superstition conquering reason, but of reason expertly deciphering a natural world filled with signals we have since learned to ignore. The modern parallels are striking. Every pilot who learns to recognize the Big Dipper for emergency orientation is tapping into the same star path tradition. The very principle of GPS, triangulating a position from multiple satellite signals, is a digital echo of the medieval method of taking cross bearings from known landmarks or stars. We have simply swapped the cosmos for a network of orbiting machines. These rediscovered secrets ultimately tell us less about navigation and more about ourselves. They are a powerful reminder of human resilience, a testament to our innate drive to solve puzzles and conquer the elements, no matter how immense the challenge. The same ingenuity that charted the world with a chip of wood and a length of knotted rope now guides rovers across the dust of Mars. The tools have changed beyond recognition, but the timeless quest to find our way through the unknown remains the very core of the human spirit. Our journey through the foggy seas of history reveals a profound truth about those who first charted the oceans. Their world was not defined by the tools they lacked, but by a breathtaking ingenuity with the ones they had. From the steadfast North Star to the mysterious sunstone, every technique was a testament to relentless observation, raw courage, and sometimes a leap of faith across an empty horizon. These pioneers were mapping more than just coastlines. They were drawing the first lines of connection for our modern world, laying the very groundwork for the globalized planet we inhabit today. So the next time a digital voice tells you to turn left in 500 feet, take a moment to remember the mariners who braved the utter unknown. Their compass was a sliver of iron floating in a bowl of water. Their map was a web of lines on treated animal skin, and their guide was the cold, constant fire of a star. They ventured forth with little more than that, and in doing so, they gave us all the world. If this voyage into the past has sparked your curiosity, we would love to hear which historical mystery should be our next destination. Share your thoughts in the comments